There we go. So for those of you who don't know me, hi, I'm Abby Piper. I'm the Business Development Manager here at Asset Tagged, of which FIREie is a solution. So many of you do know me through 20 years within the industry and my involvement with the London Health and Safety Group. So welcome, and welcome to those of you who are new and joining us for the first time. So we've got so much to cover today, so I am not going to waste any time. I just want to do a very brief introduction of Marcus and Ian, and they are our presenters today. So Marcus has got over 44 years fire industry experience. He's looking at the what, which is required across incident command and post-fire investigation. And then Ian is going to be concentrating on the how to Marcus's what. And Ian is the founder of Asset Tagged and is an experienced fire risk management professional and lead auditor. So without further ado, Marcus, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Abby. Yes, just to further explain my background, as Abby's just said, 44 years in the fire industry, 32 years with London Fire Brigade. Retired, I can't believe it, in 2011, then spent 6 or 7 years working and teaching incident command, mainly for London Fire Brigade, but also at the Fire Service College and at Seddon Park, which is a smaller fire college just outside Bristol. Since Grenfell, I've been working mainly in the residential sector, doing fire safety, etc. I also chair what's called the British Property Federation Building Safety Sounding Board, which reports directly to central government on everything to do with fire, etc. So that's a very brief overview of me. The session is going to be a very highbrow overview and very quick overview of incident command and the issues that are presently faced by incident commanders in relation to gathering information and the robustness of that information. My session is going to be split into several sections, as you can see there. Pre-incident, then the initial response and the first attendance, the decision making, incident commands and how each incident is structured, and then we'll talk a little bit about post-incident considerations following that. Next slide, please, Anna. So the first thing we need to consider is the various types of legislation which governs the pre-incident gathering of information. So we've got 4 listed there. These are the 4 main ones. Civil Contingencies Act, the Fire and Rescue Services Act, the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, and the Building Safety Act. So I won't take those in order. The Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order is of 2005, is the primary legislation that governs fire safety within England and Wales. Northern Ireland and Scotland have very similar legislation, but the RRO, as it's called, is England and Wales. And this gives the fire authorities the right to police fire safety within their geographical area of responsibility. So what the majority of fire authorities do is they have their own fire safety officers that go out to sites, and they can be of any type. If you look at the sites which are in scope of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, it's basically everything apart from single private domestic dwellings. So your house or flat obviously doesn't come under it, but the vast majority of other types of property. So the main thrust recently has been high-rise residential buildings over 18 metres. But the RRO covers everything. So if you have responsibilities for a large coma site or a coma site, if you have responsibilities for a large commercial or industrial site, that legislation applies. That means that you have to produce a fire risk assessment on a regular basis, and you will probably be audited by the local fire authority. The next piece of legislation is the Building Safety Act of 2022, which came into force following the Grenfell fire disaster and the death of 72 people. Why I mention this is because this has made huge changes to the information which is now that's now captured, stored, kept by fire authorities, and hopefully able to be used in the event of an incident. So under the Building Safety Act, there was also what's called the Fire Safety England regulations, which now makes it a requirement for management and owners and responsible persons and what's called accountable persons to provide information to fire authority electronically, information such as a layout of the building, where the fire facilities are within the building, such as your dry riser, your wet riser, your firefighting lifts, etc. That is now a legal requirement for accountable persons to provide that information to the local fire authorities electronically. The next piece of legislation is the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004. And I'm sure not everyone on this call would have heard of this. This empowers local authority, local emergency services to work together to produce emergency plans. It also requires them to carry out risk assessments within their plan of geographical responsibility. And also organise training events. So they prioritise the risks that they have within their area. They have to then produce training programs and training events and facilitate those. Now, as you can see on my slide, I've got Cat 1 and Cat 2 responders. Cat 1 responders are basically the emergency services, plus the local NHS or health authorities. And Cat 2 responders are things like utilities, transportation organisations, voluntary organisations that have a responsibility to provide information to Cat 1s in the event of an emergency. I've mentioned their local resilience forums. I've sat on 4 of those. It's a legal response or legal requirement under the Civil Contingencies Act for local authorities and local emergency services to meet on a regular basis and talk about things like the risk matrix, the risks, potential terrorist targets, things like major road closures that might affect emergency services getting to potential emergencies. All sorts of things they discuss, they produce plans. The prime example that I can give is probably what's called LESLEP, the London Emergency Services Liaison Panel. They produce what's called the LESLEP plan, and that is basically a framework that informs the emergency services and Cat 1 responders of their responsibilities in the event of emergency. For instance, who would be responsible for an inner cordon, who would be responsible for an outer cordon, who would be responsible for the traffic cordon, etc. Now, from that information, that is then fed up to the Regional Resilience Forum, which feeds the National Resilience Forum, which have very similar objectives. And eventually, in time of emergency, it's the National Resilience Forum that informs COBRA, which is the government's emergency committee, which meet during national emergency situations. The final bit of legislation is the Fire and Rescue Services Act 2004. And this under section 72D provides a responsibility for the emergency services, the fire service, to actually identify risks within their own ground. And I'm talking station ground here rather than London or a regional area. This is localised, so they have responsibility of identifying risks within their own immediate area of responsibility and visiting those sites on a regular basis and gathering information, and that information then feeds into the risk database, which is then feeds into things like predetermined attendance and also ongoing emergency plans, which can be fed into or dipped into at the time of an emergency. So all this legislation is geared around gathering information, storage of information, which then can be fed to the incident commander in the event of an emergency. Next slide, please, Anna. So the next thing is the initial response. The first thing, obviously, is the emergency services, or the fire service is called, and basically there's two ways of receiving information, either via a radio call or via a printer at the station, or actually they now have mobile data units. The information they receive initially is fairly basic. It's the address of the incident, the nature of the incident. Is it a fire? Is it a road traffic accident? Excuse me. Is it a chemical incident, etc.? Whether there's persons reported, persons involved in the incident. The list of appliances that are attending that have been sent on. So it could be a fire engine, it could be a turntable ladder, it could be a hydraulic platform, a fire rescue unit, whatever it may be. Any special risks that are recorded at that particular address or within the actual postcode of that address can also be included. And if multiple calls have been received to the incident, that makes a huge difference in the mindset of the incident commander, because the incident commander is then thinking, if the brigade have only received a single call, that's very different than if they've received 20 calls all to the same incident. So this is the very initial gathering of information by the incident commander. En route considerations, nature of the incident, obviously what they're going to, the associated risks, safety of crews, even down to, the parking of the appliance, what side the crew get off, as well as the safety requirements of that particular type of incident. Mobile data terminals, once again, on all frontline appliances, they can access those for further information en route, but they're also looking for signs on approach, such as the amount of traffic, persons, is there a lot of people mingling around, looking at the incident, the type of smoke, the colour of the smoke, the smell of the smoke, the direction of the smoke, all of this informs the incident commander and starts to assist the incident commander to formulate their initial incident response. Next slide, please, Hannah. So the next thing we talk about is the initial attendance. Now, once again, it's all about information gathering. It's all about how the information is gathered, how it's stored. At the moment, it's not particularly robust, as you'll see as we go through this. The first consideration for the incident commander is there life safety involved? Are there people hanging out the windows? Obviously, when they first show up, there may only be the incident commander, a driver, and two firefighters sat in the back of his appliance, his or her appliance. So the resources are going to be very limited. So it's about what resources are required, what immediate actions need to be taken to save life. Following that, it's about, once again, information gathering. And the way that the incident commander does that is obviously talk to responsible persons, accountable persons that are on site, if they're available, to gather information about the building, about the processes, etc. But the incident commander will also generally send a firefighter around the building to look for access points, egress points, smoke, persons involved, risks, the location, the dry riser, the wet riser inlets, the location of the premises information box, which we'll talk more about in a moment. So if we can go on to the next slide, please, Hannah. The next thing we're going to talk about is what's called a decision-making model. This is something that's used by the vast majority of fire services across the UK, not necessarily in this format, but something very similar. So if we start on the left-hand side, we've got the information about the incident that we've already talked about, how they gather that information, hazards and safety, resource information, resource requirements, etc. Once they gather that information, they have some gathering and thinking time, which then develops into objectives. That objective may be saving life, it may be saving property, it may be further resources, whatever it may be. And that will then feed into a suitable and sufficient plan. That plan will then inform communication strategy throughout the incident, not only between firefighters, officers and firefighters, but potentially press liaison officers, etc. But it's a communication is vital. Good communication is vital right across the incident grounds. And then controlling, which we'll talk more about. This is about how you structure an incident and how you make sure that the incident commander isn't overflowing with spans of control and information. We'll go into that in great detail in a moment. Now, this is continually re-evaluated throughout the incident. Objectives change on a regular basis throughout an incident, but the final outcome is a safe conclusion of the incident, and that's obviously when this decision-making model no longer becomes apparent or required. So if we move on to the next slide, Anna, please. We've talked about information, robustness of information. I've very remiss of me, I should have talked about the premises information boxes and the incident commander finding it very difficult to utilise the information within premises information boxes, which generally is out of date. Since the introduction of the Fire Safety England regs, once again, it is a legal requirement for certainly accountable persons in large residential buildings, but also it's a requirement for coma sites and large industrial and commercial sites to provide information in premises information boxes. You'll see it as well in at the front of London Underground stations, for instance. And the information in there is meant to assist the initial incident commander. But once again, in a very dynamic situation, it's very difficult to utilise paper-based information. So post-incident considerations. Once again, I mentioned the London Fire Brigade because that's what I know best. They have 2 fire investigation units. Their role is to determine the cause of the incidents, and they attend 4-pump fires, as I've already said, persons reported, large emergencies, firefighter emergencies, etc. It's very important also to look at environmental impacts, water runoff from incidents, and the prime example there would be Bunsfield. The water runoff at Bunsfield was stored in huge tanks, huge pools for several years before it was disposed of appropriately. Chemical releases during incidents, very vital to know where they are, what chemicals have been released, wind direction, etc. Same as smoke impact. The chemicals within smoke can travel for many, many miles. Grenfell being the prime example, I think they've identified contaminants from the smoke 1.5 to 2 miles away from the tower itself, and that was 18 months after the incident. They also review legislative and regulatory compliance via risk assessments. So during or after a large incident, the risk assessments will be assessed. Review of the emergency plans, were they appropriate at the time? And also they look at the personnel, the training of the personnel and the resources supplied to those personnel in the event of an emergency. So all of this sort of thing will be fully reviewed after an incident. Next slide, please. Finally, the benefits of such a post-incident review is determining the cause and origin, as I've already said, understanding fire behaviour. A lot of work goes on constantly about fire behaviour, how it responds, and informing the protocols and the strategies used in firefighting to make it as safe as it possibly can be. Identifying trends and patterns. The prime example of this was several years ago, a white goods manufacturer that particular white goods manufacturer had many fires. That was nationally, and because of the fire investigation and work of the fire investigation teams nationally, they were able to identify that trend. They were able to recall those white goods and send out a information to those that recently purchased those goods, and obviously prevented further fires in those white goods. And finally, reducing future fire losses. The ultimate goal is obviously to reduce fire-related losses, whether it be to property or whether it be to life. The main thread through all of incident command is information and communication. Unfortunately, presently, we have, because of lack of electronic systems, poor electronic systems, inconsistent electronic systems, the information that we have available for incident command is not as good as it could be. It is changing rapidly, and via those changes, it will make firefighting a far more safe occupation, and incidents will be able to be dealt with far more quickly, so saving life and saving fire losses. That is a very, very brief overview of incident command. I will now hand you over to Ian, who hopefully will be able to provide certain answers to the issues around information gathering and the robustness of that information. Cheers, guys. Thank you.